Life on the farm was peaceful, predictable even. I always thought that the quiet, routine existence was safe, far removed from the strange and unsettling things you hear about in big cities. But after one night in the summer of 2021, I realized how wrong I was. My name is Travis, and I manage a 60-acre farm in eastern Iowa. The land had been in my family for generations, and while farming wasn't always easy, I loved the work. The long days were tiring, but the evenings were tranquil, the kind of quiet you only find miles away from civilization. One night, after a long day of harvesting corn, I sat on the porch with my dog, Buck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. Everything seemed perfect until I noticed the lights. At first, I thought they were fireflies. Small, glowing orbs floated just above the cornfield, bobbing and weaving like they were caught in an invisible current. But as the light dimmed, I realized these weren't fireflies. They were larger, brighter, and their movements were unnaturally precise. "Buck, you seeing this?" I asked, scratching his head. Buck's ears perked up, his gaze fixed on the field. A low growl rumbled in his throat. That's when I noticed the lights weren't random. They were moving in a pattern, circling, almost like they were scanning the field. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle from inside the house and made my way toward the field. Buck followed close behind, his growls turning to uneasy whines. The air grew colder as I approached the edge of the field, a sharp contrast to the warm summer night. The lights continued their eerie dance, their glow illuminating the stalks of corn in brief, flickering bursts. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped into the field, the corn towering over me. The lights seemed farther away now, almost as if they were retreating. I followed cautiously, brushing aside the stalks as I moved deeper into the field. Buck stayed close, his body tense, his nose low to the ground. The further I went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had vanished, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Then, the lights stopped. They hovered in place, their glow dimming until they disappeared entirely. I turned in a slow circle, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the field was empty. "Come on, Buck," I said, my voice cracking. "Let's head back." As I turned to leave, a sharp, metallic clicking sound echoed through the field. I froze. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping the rifle tightly. The clicking grew louder, closer. Buck barked wildly, his tail tucked between his legs. Panic surged through me as I started back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how far I walked, the edge of the field never seemed to get closer. The corn felt like it was closing in, the stalks swaying even though there was no wind. And then, I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, its movements slow and deliberate. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. "Stay back," I shouted. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it stepped forward. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing across the field. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. A blinding light erupted from its chest, illuminating the entire field. I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes as the light grew brighter and brighter. When it finally dimmed, the figure was gone. I ran the rest of the way back to the house, Buck barking at my heels. Once inside, I locked the doors and windows, my hands trembling as I dialed the sheriff's office. The deputy arrived about an hour later, his expression skeptical as I explained what had happened. "Probably some teenagers messing around," he said, shining his flashlight around the field. But there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The next morning, I went back to the field to investigate. What I found still haunts me. In the center of the field was a perfect circle, about 20 feet in diameter. The corn inside the circle had been flattened, the stalks bent at sharp angles but not broken. The soil was blackened, as if it had been scorched, and there was a faint metallic smell in the air. I contacted the local agricultural extension office, hoping they could explain the strange phenomenon. A technician came out to take soil samples, but when the results came back, they were inconclusive. The circle remained for weeks, the scorched earth refusing to grow anything, and the lights never returned. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but every time I walk past that part of the field, I feel a strange sense of unease, as if something is watching me from the shadows, because some things on the farm aren't meant to be explained. Running a farm has its challenges, but there's a strange kind of solace in the routine. Early mornings, feeding the animals, working the fields, and quiet nights under a star-filled sky. My wife, Hannah, and I had owned a modest farm in Wisconsin for nearly 6 years, and we'd grown used to its rhythms. But one autumn night in 2020 shattered that sense of normalcy forever. Our farm wasn't large, just enough land for a small herd of cattle, a few chickens, and a sprawling pasture surrounded by dense woods. We loved the seclusion, the way the world felt a little smaller and simpler out here. That night, we had finished dinner and were sitting in the living room, enjoying the warmth of the wood stove. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves. It was the kind of night that made you appreciate being indoors. But then the noise started. At first, it was faint, just a soft, distant sound I almost mistook for the wind. A low, mournful bellow echoed through the trees, followed by another and another. "Hear that?" I asked, glancing at Hannah. She frowned, setting her book down. "Sounds like the cows." I nodded, but something about the sound wasn't right. It was too strained, too unnatural. "I'll check it out," I said, grabbing my flashlight and jacket. The barn was about 200 yards from the house, and the path was lit only by the faint glow of the moon. The wind bit at my face as I trudged through the yard, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bellowing grew louder as I approached the barn. It wasn't the usual sound of cows calling to each other. It was desperate, almost pained. When I reached the barn, I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. The stalls were empty. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I stepped inside, my boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. The cows should have been here, all 10 of them, but the barn was completely empty. I checked the back door, which led to the pasture. It was wide open, the lock hanging broken from the latch. Panic set in as I stepped outside, the flashlight beam sweeping across the pasture. The wind howled louder, carrying with it faint echoes of those eerie bellows. The cows were nowhere to be seen. I followed the sounds toward the edge of the woods, my heart racing. The pasture fence was intact, the gate still locked. How had the cows gotten out? As I approached the tree line, the flashlight beam caught something on the ground, deep, heavy hoof prints pressed into the soft earth. But the tracks weren't heading into the woods. They were coming out of it. I stopped in my tracks, a chill running down my spine. The hoof prints were large, larger than any I'd seen before, and they were spaced oddly, as if whatever made them had a strange gait. "Hannah!" I called out, my voice shaking. Her silhouette appeared on the porch, illuminated by the warm glow of the house lights. "What is it?" she called back. "The cows are gone," I said. "I think they—" A loud crash from deeper in the woods cut me off. It sounded like a tree snapping in half, the sharp crack echoing through the night. I turned back toward the house, waving Hannah inside. "Stay put," I shouted. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my fingers numb from the cold, and stepped cautiously into the woods. The air felt heavier here, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The beam of the flashlight danced across the trees, revealing claw-like branches and swaying leaves. The sound of the bellowing was closer now, but it had changed. It was no longer coming from one direction. The bellows surrounded me, echoing from all sides as if the forest itself were alive. "Come on," I muttered to myself, trying to keep my fear in check. "Find the cows and get out." But the further I went, the stranger things became. The hoof prints multiplied, crisscrossing in chaotic patterns that made no sense. And then I found the first one. One of the cows was lying in a clearing, its massive body motionless. At first, I thought it was dead, but as I approached, I saw its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. It was alive, but its eyes were wide with terror, and its body was covered in deep, jagged cuts that looked almost surgical. "What the hell did this?" I whispered, my breath visible in the cold air. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Something moved just beyond the edge of the clearing, something tall and impossibly fast. "Who's there?" I shouted, raising the flashlight higher. No answer. The trees seemed to shift around me, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. It was taller than any human, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, its head tilted slightly, as if studying me, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as the sounds of the bellows grew louder and more frantic. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. The bellows followed me, mingling with the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. When I finally broke through the tree line and into the yard, I slammed the barn door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Hannah was waiting on the porch, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're not alone out here," I said, grabbing her hand. "We need to call the sheriff." The deputy arrived within an hour, his expression skeptical as I explained what had happened. He and I searched the woods together, but the clearing was gone, as if it had never existed. The next morning, I found the hoof prints again, leading from the woods to the barn and back, but the cows were never found. To this day, I don't know what I saw in the woods that night, but every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I feel that same sense of dread, as if something is watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Because some things on the farm aren't meant to be found. Farm life offers a quiet that many people would envy. My wife Emma and I had been running a 40-acre farm in northern Missouri for nearly a decade, raising cattle, chickens, and rows of corn that stretched to the horizon. We enjoyed the solitude and the rhythm of farm work, but that isolation turned terrifying one stormy night in March 2022. It was late, nearing midnight, and the rain had been coming down in sheets since the afternoon. We were in the living room, the wood stove crackling as we played cards to pass the time. The dogs had curled up near the fire, their steady breathing adding to the calm atmosphere. The peace was shattered by a knock at the door. Emma froze mid-laugh, her hand of cards falling to the table. "Did you hear that?" I set my cards down and listened. Another knock, this one louder, echoed through the house. "Who could it be at this hour?" she asked, her voice uneasy. "I don't know," I said, standing up. "Stay here." Grabbing the flashlight from the counter, I made my way to the front door. The dogs perked up, their ears twitching as they stared toward the door. But they didn't bark, a bad sign. I turned on the porch light and peered through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe. He wore a dark jacket, his hood pulled low over his face. One hand rested against the doorframe, and the other hung loosely at his side. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my voice firm. The man didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was faint and shaky. "Please, I need help. My car broke down." Emma appeared behind me, whispering, "Don't open it." I nodded, my instincts screaming at me to keep the door shut. "Where's your car?" I asked. "Just down the road," the man said. "Please, I need to call for help. Why didn't you use your cell phone?" He hesitated, his head tilting slightly. "Battery's dead." The unease in my gut deepened. Something about his voice sounded rehearsed, like he was reciting lines from a script. "I'll call someone for you," I said, tightening my grip on the flashlight. "No." The man's voice suddenly grew louder, more insistent. "Just let me in. It's freezing out here." I stepped back, my heart racing. You need to leave." For a moment, the man didn't move. Then, he tilted his head again, as though trying to peer into the house. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. The words sent a chill down my spine. I reached for the shotgun mounted on the wall, motioning for Emma to grab her phone. I said, "Leave," I shouted, aiming the flashlight at the door. The man took a step back, disappearing into the shadows beyond the porch. For a moment, I thought he was gone. But then the dogs started growling, low and menacing, as if they sensed something I couldn't see. Emma was already on the phone with the police when we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window near the kitchen. I turned toward the sound, my stomach twisting in knots. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. I crept toward the window, shotgun in hand, and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The yard was empty, the rain still falling in torrents. But as I turned back toward the living room, the sound came again, this time from the back door. Emma screamed, clutching the phone as the dogs erupted into frantic barking. I ran to the back door, locking it just as the doorknob began to twist. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The twisting stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. Faintly, I picked up the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. The police were still 20 minutes away, according to Emma, and I knew we couldn't wait for them. I turned off the lights, motioning for Emma to follow me upstairs. From the bedroom window, I could see the edge of the porch illuminated by the weak glow of the yard light. The man was back, standing perfectly still just beyond the porch. He wasn't alone. 2 more figures stood with him, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, their heads tilted slightly, staring up at the house. I aimed the shotgun out the window, firing a warning shot into the air. The figures didn't flinch. Instead, they turned in unison, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, they found no sign of the intruders. But the next morning, I discovered something chilling. Near the edge of the field, where the figures had stood, were 3 deep impressions in the mud, as though they'd been rooted in place. And next to them, carved into the ground, was a single word, "Welcome." When I was growing up, my family always joked that scarecrows were the farm's quiet guardians. They stood watch over the crops, protecting them from pests and birds. But after one harrowing experience on my family's farm in Nebraska, I'll never look at scarecrows the same way again. It was early August 2019, and we were in the middle of a long, dry summer. My parents had left for a weekend getaway, leaving me to watch over the farm. At 23, I was no stranger to the responsibilities of running the place, feeding the animals, watering the crops, and checking the equipment. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, and I almost enjoyed the solitude. But on the third night, everything changed. The evening was calm, the sky painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. I had just finished my last round of chores and was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze, when I noticed something strange. The scarecrow in the middle of the cornfield looked different. It was about 100 yards away, its silhouette outlined against the fading light. Normally, its straw-filled arms stretched wide, its floppy hat tilted at an awkward angle. But tonight, it was standing perfectly straight, its arms at its sides, as if it had shifted position. I stared at it for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had knocked it down and someone had propped it up again. Still, the unease lingered. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the field. The cornstalks swayed gently in the breeze, their rustling oddly soothing. When I reached the scarecrow, I stopped, shining the beam of light over it. It was definitely standing straighter than before, its head tilted slightly forward as if it were looking down at me. The clothes were the same, an old plaid shirt and faded overalls, but the face was different. The burlap sack that made up its head had been replaced. The new one was crudely stitched together, with uneven holes for eyes and a wide, jagged smile sewn into the fabric. My stomach churned. "All right, who's messing with me?" I called out, scanning the field with the flashlight. The only response was the whisper of the wind through the corn. I shook my head, annoyed at myself for feeling so spooked. "It's just a scarecrow," I muttered, turning back toward the house. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I kept picturing the scarecrow's new face, that stitched smile etched into my mind. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud bang. I sat up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The sound had come from outside. I crept to the window and peered out. The yard was bathed in moonlight, everything eerily still. Then I saw it. The scarecrow was no longer in the field. It was standing in the middle of the yard. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my mind racing. How could it have moved? I grabbed the shotgun from the closet and made my way downstairs, my hands trembling. When I opened the front door, the scarecrow was gone. The yard was empty, the only sound the soft rustling of the corn. I stepped outside, the shotgun raised, and scanned the area with the flashlight. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were deep and heavy, leading from the field to the porch. And they weren't made by boots or bare feet. They looked like claws. I backed toward the house, my heart pounding. Before I could reach the door, the cornfield erupted with movement. The stalks swayed violently, as if something massive was moving through them. The bellow of a cow echoed across the field, a sound of pure terror. I sprinted back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. For hours, I sat by the window, the shotgun across my lap, watching the field. The rustling eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But the unease lingered, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside. The scarecrow was back in the field, standing in its original position. But something was wrong. Its overalls were smeared with blood, and the stitched smile had been replaced with a jagged, open mouth. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, and that's when I saw the cow. It was lying at the edge of the field, its body mangled beyond recognition. Deep claw marks raked across its hide, and its lifeless eyes stared blankly at the sky. I called the sheriff, but by the time they arrived, the scarecrow was gone. The post it had been mounted on was empty, the ground around it trampled as if something had clawed its way free. The sheriff chalked it up to an animal attack, but I knew better. I sold the farm a month later, unable to shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear the rustling of the corn. And every time I see a scarecrow, I can't help but wonder if it's watching me back. Farming is a life of routine. Early mornings, long hours, and quiet nights. My wife Lisa and I owned a modest farm in southern Illinois, where we raised corn, soybeans, and a small herd of cattle. Despite the isolation of rural life, I always felt safe on the farm, until one night in late October 2020, when that sense of safety was shattered. That evening, Lisa and I had just finished dinner. The chill of autumn had settled in, and the wind howled against the windows as we sat in the living room, sipping tea and watching TV. The house was warm, the lights casting a comforting glow over the space. Everything seemed normal until we heard the first knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Lisa glanced at me. "Did you hear that?" I muted the TV, straining to listen. A few seconds later, it came again. 3 sharp knocks, louder this time. I frowned. It was unusual for anyone to show up unannounced, especially after dark. Our nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and visitors always called ahead. "I'll check," I said, setting down my mug. Lisa followed me to the door, her unease mirrored in her expression. "Be careful," she said, clutching my arm. I turned on the porch light and peered through the peephole. A man was standing on the porch, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. "Can I help you?" I called through the door. The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised his head slightly, revealing pale skin and hollow eyes that glinted unnaturally in the light. A chill ran down my spine. I said, "Can I help you?" I repeated, louder this time. The man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "My car broke down," he said. "I need to use your phone." His words didn't sit right with me. Something about his tone felt off, too rehearsed, like he'd said it 100 times before. "I can call for help for you," I offered, keeping my hand on the doorknob. "No need," he said quickly. "Just let me in. It's cold out here." Lisa shook her head behind me, mouthing, "Don't." I tightened my grip on the doorknob, my instincts screaming at me to keep it closed. "Wait here," I said, stepping away from the door. "I'll call someone." I grabbed my phone and dialed the local sheriff's office, explaining the situation. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone out to check on the man. When I returned to the door, he was gone. The porch was empty, the only sign of his presence a set of footprints leading down the steps. I closed and locked the door, my nerves on edge. Lisa and I double-checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. "He's probably just some drifter," I said, trying to reassure her and myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. An hour later, we heard it again. 3 sharp knocks, this time on the back door. Lisa gasped, clutching my arm. How did he get back there? I grabbed the shotgun from the cabinet and made my way to the kitchen, my heart pounding. The back door had no peephole, so I flipped on the porch light. The man was standing there, his face pressed against the glass. "Leave now," I shouted, raising the shotgun. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that made my blood run cold. "We just want to talk," he said. "We." The word echoed in my mind as I realized what he meant. I turned to look out the window above the sink, and my stomach dropped. There were more of them. At least half a dozen figures stood in the yard, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the faint light. Each one wore a similar wide-brimmed hat, their faces obscured by shadows. They stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly, as if they were watching, waiting. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. "We're calling the police," I shouted, but the words felt hollow. Lisa grabbed the phone, dialing frantically. The man at the door knocked again, harder this time. "It's no use," he said, his voice echoing through the glass. "They won't get here in time." The words sent a wave of fear through me. How could he know how far away help was? Suddenly, one of the windows shattered. The sound was deafening, the cold wind rushing into the kitchen. I spun around, aiming the shotgun at the broken pane, but the figures were gone. Lisa screamed from the living room. I ran to her, finding her staring at the front door. The locks were rattling, the doorknob twisting violently as someone tried to force their way in. I raised the shotgun, aiming at the door. "Get out of here," I shouted. For a moment, everything went still. Then the man's voice came again, faint but clear. "You can't keep us out forever." The next few minutes were a blur. Lisa and I barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, the intruders were gone. The deputy found no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all, except for the shattered window and the footprints in the yard. To this day, I don't know who or what those people were. But every time the wind howls against the windows, I remember their voices, and I wonder if they'll come back. Living on a farm means learning to trust the land, the rhythms of the seasons, the habits of the animals, and even the sounds of the wind all become part of your life. But one summer night in 2020, something disrupted that rhythm, something I still struggle to explain. My family had owned our 100-acre farm in Kansas for generations. It was a peaceful place, with sprawling fields of wheat and corn that stretched as far as the eye could see. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds at night were the chirps of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. That summer, I was alone on the farm. My parents had gone to visit relatives in Colorado, leaving me to take care of the crops and animals. I didn't mind the solitude until that night. It started with a strange noise. I was sitting on the porch after dinner, enjoying the cool evening air, when I heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the cornfield. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Coyotes were common in the area, and they sometimes wandered close to the house. But this sound was different, almost like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the field, shining the beam between the tall stalks. "Hello?" I called out. The thumping stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. The crickets had gone silent, and the air felt unnaturally still. "Probably just the wind," I muttered, trying to reassure myself. But as I turned to head back to the house, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape moving through the corn. I froze, my heart pounding. The shape was tall, easily over 6 feet, and it moved with a strange, jerky gait, almost as if it were limping. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping closer. "Who's there?" No response. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took another step toward the field. The stalks rustled as the figure disappeared deeper into the corn, and the thumping sound resumed, fading into the distance. Unease settled over me as I walked back to the house, locking the doors behind me. I told myself it was probably just a drifter passing through, someone looking for a place to sleep. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house made me jump, and I kept my shotgun within arm's reach. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I was relieved to put the night behind me. But the unease lingered as I went about my chores. It wasn't until late afternoon, while I was checking the irrigation system near the edge of the field, that I noticed something odd. One of the scarecrows was missing. We had 3 scarecrows placed around the field, their tattered clothes and straw-stuffed heads meant to keep the crows away. But the one nearest to the irrigation pump was gone, its wooden post standing bare. At first, I thought the wind might have knocked it over, but when I searched the area, I found no sign of it. Instead, I found footprints. The prints were large and deeply embedded in the soil, as if whoever made them was incredibly heavy. They led from the scarecrow's post into the cornfield, where they disappeared among the stalks. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the tracks. Something about them didn't look right. The shape was wrong, almost inhuman. I decided to finish my chores quickly and head back to the house before sunset. That night, the thumping returned. It started around 11 p.m., faint at first but growing louder and more insistent. This time, it was closer, much closer. I grabbed the shotgun and the flashlight, my hands trembling as I crept to the window. The beam of the flashlight swept across the yard, illuminating the edge of the cornfield. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the fence, its silhouette outlined against the dark sky. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the flashlight's beam rested on it. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then, without warning, it stepped over the fence and began walking toward the house. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing across the fields. The figure stopped, its head tilting again. For a moment, I thought it might retreat, but then it took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me as I slammed the door shut and locked it, retreating to the kitchen. The thumping sound grew louder, echoing through the house as the figure circled the perimeter. It wasn't until hours later, just before dawn, that the noise finally stopped. When I stepped outside, shotgun in hand, the yard was empty. But something had changed. The remaining scarecrows were gone, their posts stripped bare. And in their place, I found more footprints, leading away from the house and into the woods. I never saw the figure again, but I sold the farm the following spring. To this day, I can't walk past a cornfield without feeling that same sense of unease, that same prickling at the back of my neck. Because sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, and I wonder if the field watcher is still out there, waiting. Farms have their share of mysteries, unexplained noises, strange weather patterns, and fleeting glimpses of things you can't quite identify. But nothing prepared me for the night the fog rolled in, bringing something far more sinister with it. In 2018, I moved to a small farm in rural Montana. It was a dream of mine to escape the chaos of city life and embrace the simplicity of living off the land. The property wasn't large, but it had everything I needed. A modest house, a few acres of fields, and an old barn that had been standing since the early 1900s. The barn was a relic of the past, its red paint faded and peeling, its wooden beams weathered by decades of wind and snow. I didn't use it much, except for storing tools and the occasional bale of hay. But that barn became the epicenter of a nightmare I'll never forget. It started on an unusually cold September night. I'd just finished my evening chores and was heading back to the house when I noticed the fog. It rolled in fast, blanketing the fields in a thick, gray haze. The air grew damp and heavy, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I paused on the porch, watching as the barn disappeared into the mist. Something about it felt wrong. The fog was too dense, too sudden, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. Shaking off my unease, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The first noise came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint creaking sound. It was rhythmic, like the slow groan of wood under pressure. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded deliberate, like footsteps. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and peered out the window. The fog was still thick, swirling around the barn like a living thing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. But as I stood there, the creaking grew louder, more insistent. Reluctantly, I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed the shotgun from the closet, and stepped outside. The air was eerily silent, the usual sounds of crickets and distant coyotes replaced by an oppressive stillness. I made my way toward the barn, the flashlight cutting through the fog in shaky beams. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The barn loomed out of the mist, its silhouette dark and foreboding. As I reached the door, I noticed something strange. The padlock was undone, the heavy chain dangling loosely from the latch. I knew for a fact I had locked it earlier that day. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The beam of the flashlight swept across the interior, revealing rows of old tools and stacks of hay. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I stepped inside, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the middle of the floor was a pile of dirt, fresh, damp soil that hadn't been there before. I knelt down, running my fingers over it. It was loose, as if someone had been digging. That's when I saw the footprints. They were large and heavy, leading from the pile of dirt to the far corner of the barn. I followed them cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints stopped at a small trapdoor I hadn't even known was there, hidden beneath a layer of hay. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity, and something else, a strange pull I couldn't explain, compelled me forward. I descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I went deeper, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dirt-floored room. In the center of the room was a wooden table, and on the table was something I couldn't explain. It was a crude, makeshift altar, surrounded by melted candles and strange symbols etched into the wood. On the altar sat a bundle of old, tattered cloth, tied with twine. I approached cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I untied the bundle, I found a small, worn book and what looked like a bone, a human bone. The book's cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were filled with strange, handwritten text in a language I didn't recognize. A sudden noise from above made me freeze. It was the creaking again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was walking across the barn floor. I shoved the book and the bone back into the cloth, tying it hastily before scrambling up the stairs. When I reached the top, the barn was empty, but the footprints had returned, leading from the trapdoor to the main entrance. I bolted out of the barn, locking the door behind me and running back to the house. For the rest of the night, I sat by the window, shotgun in hand, watching the barn through the fog. Nothing happened, But the unease didn't fade. The next morning, I went back to the barn with a neighbor, hoping for some answers. When we opened the door, the pile of dirt was gone. So were the footprints, the trapdoor, and the altar. It was as if none of it had ever been there. But I know what I saw. To this day, I keep the barn locked, and I haven't been back inside. And every time the fog rolls in, I can't help but wonder if it's waiting for me to return. Living on a farm often means a peaceful life, but the isolation can turn unsettling in the blink of an eye. That's exactly what happened one October night in 2022, when a seemingly normal evening became something I'll never forget. My wife, Lauren, and I owned a 50-acre farm in western Minnesota. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to keep us busy raising crops and tending to a small herd of cattle. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, and the only sounds at night came from the wind rustling through the fields. That evening, we had just finished dinner and were settling in for a quiet night. The weather was unusually chilly, and a light drizzle tapped against the windows as we watched a movie in the living room. Everything seemed normal until the knock came. It was faint at first, almost inaudible over the rain. Lauren paused the movie, frowning. "Did you hear that?" I listened, straining to pick up the sound. After a few moments, it came again. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. I got up, my unease growing. Visitors were rare, especially this late. Most people knew better than to stop by unannounced. "Stay here," I told Lauren, grabbing the flashlight from the counter. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark porch illuminated by the weak glow of the overhead light. But then, movement caught my eye. A figure stood at the edge of the porch, barely visible in the shadows. They were tall and hunched, wearing what looked like a long coat. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my voice firm. The figure stepped closer, their face still obscured. "Please," they said, their voice low and shaky. "I need help. My car broke down." Normally, I wouldn't hesitate to help someone in need, but something about their tone made me pause. "Where's your car?" I asked. "Down the road," they replied quickly. "I just need to use your phone." I glanced back at Lauren, who was watching anxiously from the living room. She shook her head, mouthing, "Don't open it." "I can call someone for you," I said, keeping my hand on the door. "No," the figure replied, their voice suddenly firmer. "Let me in. It's cold out here." A chill ran down my spine. Something about the way they said it felt off. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, "but I can't let you in." The figure was silent for a moment, then took a step back into the shadows. "Suit yourself," they said, their voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Frustration? Amusement? I waited by the door, my heart pounding, until the figure disappeared into the night. For a while, everything seemed calm. I locked the door and returned to the living room, trying to brush off the encounter. But an hour later, the knocking started again. This time, it was at the back door. Lauren gasped, clutching my arm. How did they get back there? I grabbed the shotgun from the closet, my hands trembling. The back door had no peephole, so I flipped on the porch light. The figure was there, standing perfectly still, their face turned away from the light. "Leave now," I shouted, raising the shotgun. They didn't move. "I mean it," I yelled, my voice cracking. The figure slowly turned their head, revealing a face that didn't seem right. Their skin was pale, almost waxy, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. "We just want to talk," they said, their tone eerily calm. "We." The words sent a wave of dread through me. I turned toward the window and saw them. More figures, standing in the field just beyond the yard. There were at least 6 of them, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Each one stood perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly, as if they were watching. I shouted at Lauren to call the police, but deep down, I knew it would be too late. Out here, response times were slow, and the nearest station was over 20 miles away. The figure at the door knocked again, harder this time. "You can't keep us out forever," they said. Panic surged through me as I backed away from the door. Lauren was already on the phone, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. The figures in the field began to move, their steps slow and deliberate. They were coming closer. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing across the fields. For a moment, everything went still. Then, one by one, the figures turned and disappeared into the night. The figure at the door was gone too, leaving nothing but silence behind. When the police finally arrived an hour later, they found no sign of the intruders. But the next morning, we discovered something chilling. Near the edge of the field, where the figures had been standing, was a circle of freshly disturbed soil. In the center of the circle was a bundle of sticks tied with twine, surrounded by strange symbols etched into the dirt. We never figured out who or what came to our farm that night. But every time I hear a knock at the door, I can't help but feel a sense of dread, wondering if they'll come back.